While Margaret Ellis lay in a hospital bed, unable to speak, her children made their move. They sold her house. They cleared everything she owned. They placed her in a care facility an hour away from the town she had lived in her entire life. And then they told her something even worse, that her sister had been too busy to call. For 2 years, Margaret believed it. She waited for the phone to ring every Sunday morning. It never did. What Margaret didn't know, what David and Susan were certain she would never discover, was that her sister hadn't been busy. She had been watching what they were doing, writing it down, preparing for the day Margaret would finally need the truth. And when that day came, it didn't come with a phone call. It came in a small wooden box, delivered to her room on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, at a time when her children were nowhere near. This is the story of what was inside that box, and what it cost two people who thought they had already won everything. If stories like this are why you are here, subscribe now, because this one is just getting started. By the time Margaret Ellis opened her eyes in the hospital, her life had already been decided. The house, the garden, everything she had built over 41 years, gone. All of it handled in conversations she was never part of. 3 days earlier, she had been standing in her kitchen making tea. Margaret had lived in that house for 41 years. Number 12, Rose Hill Close, a quiet street in Derbyshire, a small front garden, a narrow kitchen that looked out onto the back lawn, and a boiler that had needed replacing for years but kept going anyway. It was the kind of house you stop noticing after a while. Not because it doesn't matter, but because it becomes part of you. She had raised David and Susan there, watched them grow up in those rooms, watched them leave. She had buried her husband from that house 12 years ago, and then she had stayed, quietly, getting on with things the way she always had. She taught primary school for most of her life, 31 years, mostly younger children, the quiet ones, the ones other teachers didn't quite know what to do with. She understood them, because she had always been a little like that herself. She retired at 68, 2 years after her husband passed, when the commute and the cold mornings and the weight of other people's children finally became more than her body wanted to carry. She did not miss the work exactly. She missed the children, the particular faces of the ones who had surprised her. Her life after retirement was small and full. The garden took most of her mornings. She grew vegetables along the back fence and flowers along the front path, and had strong opinions about both that she shared freely with anyone who asked, and occasionally with people who hadn't. Tuesday afternoons, she volunteered at the local library, reshelving books and running a reading group for older residents that had started with 4 members and grown to 14 over 6 years. Friday evenings, she cooked a proper meal. Not for anyone in particular, just because Friday had always been a proper meal day, and she saw no reason to change it. And every Sunday morning, without exception, she called Eleanor Briggs, née Ellis, her younger sister by 4 years. The person who had known her longer than anyone still living, who remembered their mother's voice, their father's particular way of laughing at his own jokes, the house they had grown up in before it was sold and turned into something unrecognizable, who remembered Margaret before she was a wife or a mother or a teacher, when she was just Margaret. They had not always been close. Life had done what life does, pulled them in different directions, different towns, different marriages, different years of difficulty that they had each navigated mostly alone because asking for help had not been something their family did. Eleanor had moved to the Lake District with her husband Gerald in 1987. Gerald had died in 2019. After that, Eleanor had stayed. The cottage was paid for, the village suited her, and she was not the kind of woman who moved somewhere new in her 70s simply because the reason she had come was gone. The Sunday calls had started the year Gerald died. Margaret had simply begun calling, every Sunday at 10 in the morning, and Eleanor had simply begun answering, and neither of them had ever discussed it or made it formal or acknowledged that they were doing something deliberate. It just became the shape of their weeks, something reliable in the particular way that only old bonds can be reliable. Not because they are maintained, but because they are simply there, the way rivers are there, older than the people who live beside them. They talked about nothing important, the garden, the reading group, a program one of them had watched and the other hadn't. What the weather was doing in Derbyshire versus the Lake District, which Eleanor maintained was always worse in the lakes regardless of evidence. Old memories that surfaced without warning and were examined briefly and set back down. Complaints about their bodies that they delivered with the dry humor of women who had decided that since aging was compulsory, at least it could be occasionally funny. What they never talked about was David and Susan. Not directly. Eleanor would ask how they were. Margaret would give an answer that was technically true and emotionally incomplete. Eleanor would listen to the shape of the answer. Not the words, but the particular way Margaret's voice moved around the subject. And she would understand, without needing it spelled out, exactly what her sister was not saying. What Margaret was not saying was this. David called once a fortnight, reliably, at a time that suited him. The calls lasted approximately 12 minutes. He asked questions but did not wait for the full answers. He had a quality of efficient affection. He covered the required ground of caring without allowing it to take too long. He was successful. He was busy. He was not unkind exactly, just perpetually elsewhere even when he was present. Susan visited 4 times a year. She arrived with wine and good intentions and left with the quiet relief of someone completing an obligation. She talked about her own life at length and listened to Margaret's with the particular distracted attention of someone who is waiting for their turn to speak again. She was not a bad person. She was a person who had decided, without ever quite articulating it, that her mother was fine and would continue to be fine and therefore did not require anything more than what she was already receiving. Margaret did not complain about either of them. She had raised them, after all. Whatever they were, she had played a part in making them. But Eleanor heard it anyway. In the Sunday calls, in the careful way Margaret talked around certain things, Eleanor heard what her sister could not bring herself to say directly. And somewhere in the last years of her life, though Margaret did not know this yet, would not know it for a long time, Eleanor had begun to do something about it. But that comes later. First, the morning of the 14th of March. Margaret was in the kitchen making tea. The kettle had just boiled. She had taken her mug from the cupboard, the blue one with the small chip on the handle that she kept meaning to replace and never did. She had put the tea bag in. She had reached for the kettle. Then the floor came up to meet her. She did not feel herself fall. She did not feel anything at all. The kettle stayed on the counter, still hot. The mug stayed on the counter beside it. And Margaret Ellis lay on the kitchen floor of the house she had lived in for 41 years, alone, on a Tuesday morning in March, while outside the garden she had tended for decades went quietly about its business in the pale spring light. Her neighbor found her 40 minutes later. By the time the ambulance arrived, David and Susan had already been called. And by the time Margaret regained consciousness in the hospital 3 days later, certain decisions had already been made, without her. The decisions David and Susan made while Margaret was unconscious took 11 days to fully execute. They told the hospital she lived alone with no support network. They told the hospital the house was not accessible for someone with mobility difficulties. They told the hospital they had looked into her options and found a very good place, very well reviewed, everything taken care of, nothing for anyone to worry about. The hospital was busy, the ward was understaffed. The social worker assigned to Margaret's case had 47 other cases and 3 weeks of annual leave she had not yet taken. She spoke to David twice on the phone and accepted what he told her because what he told her was delivered with the confident fluency of a man who had prepared for the conversation. The house was listed with an estate agent before Margaret was discharged. Margaret did not know this when she arrived at Pineview Care Home on a Wednesday afternoon in April, still unsteady on her feet, still losing words mid-sentence the way stroke survivors do, reaching for something familiar and finding a gap where it used to be. She thought she was going somewhere temporary, somewhere to recover, somewhere she would stay for a few months while the house was adapted, while she got stronger, while things were sorted out. David had used the word temporary 3 times on the drive over. He did not use it again after that. Pineview was not a bad place. That was perhaps the most difficult thing about it. It was clean. The staff were competent and mostly kind. The meals arrived on time. The corridors smelled of industrial cleaning products rather than anything worse. There was a television lounge and a small garden that residents could use in good weather and a weekly activity schedule that someone had clearly put genuine effort into. Margaret's room was on the 2nd floor, single bed, single wardrobe, single chair beside a single window. The window faced the car park. She had brought 3 boxes of personal items. David had packed them. When she opened them, she found clothes, toiletries, her husband's watch, and a photograph of herself with David and Susan at Christmas several years ago. Everything else, her books, her garden tools, her mother's dishes, the quilt she had made the winter after her husband died, 41 years of accumulated life, had been placed in storage, David said, until things were more settled. Things were never more settled. The storage unit was cleared 6 months later without her knowledge. The house sold in August. Margaret found out about the house from another resident whose daughter had seen the listing online. She confronted David on his next visit. He explained it carefully, reasonably, with the particular patience of someone who has rehearsed an explanation until all the edges that might catch on something have been smoothed away. The house needed too much work for her to return to. The medical bills had been significant. The proceeds were being managed responsibly. Everything was being done with her best interests at heart. Margaret listened to all of it. Then she asked about Eleanor. David said Eleanor was fine, traveling a little, not great on the phone these days. He would pass on Margaret's love. He did not meet her eyes when he said it. Margaret noticed. She filed it away in the place she kept things she was not yet ready to examine. The months settled into a routine that had nothing of her old life in it. Breakfast at 8, lunch at 12:30, dinner at 5:30, which Margaret found barbaric but had stopped saying so because saying so changed nothing. Television in the lounge if she wanted company. Her room if she didn't. A walk in the small garden when the weather permitted, and her legs agreed, which was not always simultaneously. She read constantly. The facility had a small library set, 2 shelves of donated paperbacks, mostly thrillers and romances with broken spines. And she worked through them methodically, not because she particularly wanted to, but because reading kept the silence at a manageable distance. She thought about Eleanor every day. The Sunday calls had stopped the week of the stroke and had not resumed. At first she had assumed Eleanor simply didn't know. That David and Susan hadn't told her, that Eleanor was waiting for Margaret to call. But Margaret had no phone of her own in those first weeks, and by the time she had access to one, the story had changed. Eleanor was unwell. Eleanor was traveling. Eleanor had never been very good with technology. Eleanor would call when she was able. Eleanor never called. Margaret asked for Eleanor's number from Susan on a Sunday afternoon in November, 8 months into her time at Pineview. Susan wrote it on a piece of paper and handed it over without expression. Margaret called it that evening. A recorded message told her the number was no longer in service. She called Susan immediately. Susan said she must have written it down wrong. She would find the correct number and send it. She never sent it. Margaret lay in her single bed that night facing the ceiling and felt something shift in the place where she kept the things she was not yet ready to examine. The shift felt like certainty arriving. Not yet in the form of words, just a weight, heavy and cold and shaped exactly like grief. She did not sleep. And the next morning she went to breakfast and ate her toast and said good morning to the woman who sat across from her every day and whose name she still had not learned, because learning it had felt for reasons she couldn't explain, like accepting something she was not ready to accept. A second year began. The car park outside her window was resurfaced in the spring. New yellow lines. A skip that arrived one Tuesday and was gone by Thursday. Small events that her window framed like a television screen showing a channel she had not chosen. David visited at Christmas and her birthday. Susan visited at Christmas. Nobody mentioned Eleanor. Margaret stopped asking, not because she had stopped wanting to know, but because she already did. On a Tuesday afternoon in September, 26 months after she had arrived at Pineview, a care worker knocked on Margaret's door and told her there was a delivery for her at reception. A box. Sent by a solicitor's office in Cumbria, addressed to her by name. The care worker offered to carry it up. Margaret said she would collect it herself. She took the stairs slowly, one hand on the rail, the way she had learned to move in the months since the stroke, carefully, deliberately, with the particular attention of someone who has been reminded that the body does not always do what the mind expects. The box was on the reception desk. Small, old wood, dark with age, a brass clasp on the front. On the top, in handwriting Margaret recognized before her mind had time to confirm it, were 4 words. For Margaret. From Eleanor. Margaret stood at the reception desk and held the box and did not move for a long time. The care worker at the desk asked if she was all right. Margaret said yes. Then she carried the box upstairs to her room, sat down in the chair beside the window, and opened it. The box contained 4 things. A letter in Eleanor's handwriting, folded twice, sealed with a small sticker that had a pattern of blue flowers on it, the kind their mother used to put on birthday cards when they were children. A photograph. The 2 of them outside the house they had grown up in, summer, sometime in the early 1970s. Margaret was 11 or 12. Eleanor was 7 or 8. They were squinting into the sun, and Eleanor had her arm around Margaret's waist, and they were both laughing at something outside the frame. A small music box, pale blue enamel, the paint worn thin at the corners from decades of handling. Margaret knew it immediately. Their mother had kept it on her dressing table. It had played a particular waltz, 3 notes repeating before the melody opened out. And as children they had been allowed to wind it on Sunday evenings before bed, and a brass key on a pale blue ribbon with a small cardboard tag attached. On the tag, in Eleanor's handwriting, "The cottage. Yours now. Go when you're ready." Margaret looked at these 4 things arranged on her lap for a long time before she touched any of them. Then she picked up the music box. She turned the small brass key on the underside 3 times the way she had done as a child, and set it on the windowsill and listened to it play. 3 notes. Then the melody opening out. She had not heard that sound in 50 years. She sat with it until it wound down and the room was quiet again. Then she picked up the letter. Eleanor had written it in stages. Margaret could tell by the slight variations in the ink, darker in some places, lighter in others, the handwriting shifting almost imperceptibly between the composed and the tired. She had written it over time, returning to it, adding to it, making sure it said what she needed it to say. It began simply, "My dear Maggie." Nobody had called her Maggie in years. Their mother had called her that. Eleanor had always called her that when it was just the 2 of them, when the formality that adult life required had been set aside for something older. If you are reading this, then I am already gone, and I'm sorry I could not find a way to tell you myself. I want you to know that I tried. I wrote you letters I didn't send and made phone calls I ended before they connected and drove halfway to Derbyshire twice before turning back. I was afraid that if I told you I was dying, you would spend whatever time we had left worrying about me instead of living your own life. That was probably foolish of me. It was certainly selfish in its own way. But it was the only way I knew how to love you by the end, at a distance, quietly, making sure the things that needed doing were done. Margaret stopped reading. She looked out at the car park. A van was reversing into a space. The driver took 3 attempts. Ordinary life, going about itself, entirely indifferent. She looked back at the letter. I have known for some time what David and Susan were planning. I want to be careful how I say this because I do not want you to spend energy on anger that could be spent on something better. But I need you to know that what happened to you was not an accident, and it was not inevitable, and it was not your fault for trusting people you had every reason to trust. They made a choice. They made it deliberately, and I could not stop them from making it, but I made very sure that they could not make it permanent. Margaret read that paragraph 3 times. Then she continued, "The cottage is yours. I have had it arranged legally and properly, and there is a solicitor named Mr. Hartley in Keswick who has all the documentation and who is expecting you to contact him. The savings are yours also. Not a great amount, but enough, more than enough, for you to live without worrying. Gerald's life insurance was more than I ever needed, and I spent 20 years not spending it for no good reason I can now remember. There is also a folder in the desk in the cottage sitting room. I am sorry to tell you that it contains some things that will be difficult to read. Records I kept, notes I made, dates and decisions and conversations I was told about secondhand. I kept them because I thought you might need them, and I hope very much that you do not. But they are there if you do. The garden needs attention. I haven't been able to manage it properly for the last 2 years, and I know it shows. The roses along the front path are the ones from Mum's garden. I took cuttings the year before the house was sold, and I've been growing them ever since. 30 years. They're quite established now. I think you'll be pleased with them." She was nearly at the end. The handwriting in the final paragraph was slightly unsteady. Written last, Margaret thought. Written when Eleanor was tiredest. Do you remember what Mum used to say when she put us to bed? On the nights when we'd had a hard day, or we were frightened of something, or the world felt larger than we knew how to manage. She used to say, "You are exactly where you are supposed to be." I don't know if that's true. I'm not sure it was ever true in the way she meant it, but I know this. You are supposed to be in that cottage. I kept it for you. I kept everything for you, and wherever I am now, I am not worried about you anymore. All my love, always. Your Ellie. Margaret folded the letter carefully along its original creases. She placed it back in the box beside the photograph and the music box and the key. Then she sat for a very long time in the chair by the window, watching the car park do nothing in particular, while something that had been tightly wound inside her chest for 2 years slowly, finally, began to loosen. She was going to the cottage. Not today. Her legs were not ready, and she had things to arrange and Mr. Hartley to call, and forms that would need to be signed. But soon. And the people who had put her in this room with its single window and its view of a car park were not going to be part of what happened next. That decision, she realized, had already been made. The moment she read yours now on a small cardboard tag tied to a brass key, it had already been made. She called Mr. Hartley the following morning. He was expecting her. His voice carried the particular warmth of someone who had been holding something in trust for a long time and was glad to finally be handing it over. He confirmed everything Eleanor's letter had said. The cottage was hers. The savings were hers. The paperwork was already prepared and waiting for her signature. He could come to her if that was easier. He would come that Friday. Margaret said Friday was fine. Then she hung up and sat quietly for a moment with the phone in her lap. Then she called David. He answered on the third ring with the slightly distracted tone of a man who had been in the middle of something and had decided to answer anyway as a demonstration of good character. Margaret told him she would be leaving Pineview. A pause. David said that was something they should probably discuss as a family before any decisions were made. He said her health was still a consideration. He said the care facility had been working well and making changes at this stage seemed perhaps premature. He said all of this in the same reasonable, prepared tone he had used in the hospital, in the meetings with the social worker, in every conversation where he had made a decision about her life and presented it as a collaborative discussion. Margaret listened to all of it. Then she said she was not asking for his opinion. She was letting him know. Another pause. Longer this time. He said he would call Susan and they would come at the weekend to talk it through properly. Margaret said there was nothing to talk through. Mr. Hartley was coming Friday. She would be leaving within the fortnight. She would be in touch once she was settled. Then she said goodbye and ended the call before he could find his next sentence. She sat with the phone in her lap for a moment after. Her hands were not shaking. She noticed this with something close to surprise. Mr. Hartley was a small, neat man in his 60s who arrived precisely on time, carrying a briefcase and a tin of shortbread that he said was from his wife, who had heard about Margaret from Eleanor and had wanted to send something. Margaret thanked him and put the kettle on, and they sat at the small table in the corner of a room that was meant for visitors and worked through the documents together with the methodical care of two people who understood that paperwork, however dull, was the mechanism through which things became real. By the time he left, everything was signed. The cottage was legally, completely, irrevocably hers. She ate 2 pieces of the shortbread and then put the tin in her suitcase because it seemed like the kind of thing Eleanor would have appreciated her doing. David and Susan came on Saturday as promised. They sat in the 2 chairs that the care facility provided for visitors, arranged with the careful symmetry of people who had agreed beforehand on their approach, and they made their case. The cottage was remote. Her health was unpredictable. Living alone in the Lake District at 76 with no support network nearby was not a reasonable plan. They were not saying this to be obstructive. They were saying it because they cared about her welfare. Margaret let them finish. Then she told them that the cottage had been left to her by Eleanor. Susan's expression shifted. Margaret watched it shift and said nothing and let the shift complete itself. She told them Mr. Hartley had visited. That everything was signed, that she was leaving Pineview in 11 days and would be traveling to Cumbria by train. David said Eleanor never mentioned anything about the cottage. Margaret said no. She wouldn't have. He asked what that meant. Margaret said it meant Eleanor was a great deal more perceptive than either of them had given her credit for. She did not mention the folder in the desk. Not yet. She had not read it herself yet. But she knew it was there, and the knowledge of it sat quietly behind everything she said in that conversation, like a door that had not yet been opened, but whose existence changed the shape of the room. David tried several more approaches. Each one was met with the same calm that Margaret had discovered in herself since reading the letter. Not the careful managed calm of someone suppressing something, but the genuine kind, the kind that comes from having made a decision so completely that there is no longer anything to argue about. They left after 40 minutes. Margaret watched their car exit the car park from her window. Then she began to pack. She had very little. 3 boxes in, 3 boxes out. The same boxes that had arrived with her, more or less, minus the things that had worn out or been discarded, and plus the letter, the photograph, the music box, the key, and Mr. Hartley's wife's shortbread tin. She packed the music box last, wrapped in a cardigan, placed at the top of the 3rd box where she could reach it easily. 11 days later, a taxi arrived at Pineview at 9 in the morning. Margaret carried her own boxes to it, one at a time, slowly, one hand always free for the rail. The woman at reception said they would miss her. Margaret thanked her and meant it, and got into the taxi and did not look back at the building as it pulled away. She had spent 2 years looking at that building's car park. She had no interest in what it looked like from the outside. The train from Derby to Oxenholme took 2 hours and 20 minutes. Margaret sat by the window and watched England change around her, the flat Midlands giving way to the particular quality of northern light, the hills beginning to suggest themselves on the horizon, the sky opening out in the way it does when you are heading somewhere that has more sky than people. She had not been on a train alone in 4 years. Her body remembered how to do it. You sat down, you watched, you let the movement carry you. She changed at Oxenholme and took the slower local train toward the lakes, the one that stops at small stations with hand-painted signs and takes its time about the whole business as if it knows where you are going and understands that you should not arrive too quickly. A taxi from the station. A driver who recognized the address and said it was a pretty part of the world up that way, very quiet. Did she know it at all? Margaret said she was going for the first time. The driver said she would like it. Then he drove, and she watched, and the roads narrowed and the stone walls appeared on both sides, and the light went golden the way Lake District light does in the late afternoon, and Margaret held the box with the music box inside on her lap, and felt something she had not felt in 2 years. She felt like herself. Not the herself of Pineview who ate at 5:30 and watched other people's car parks and waited for visits that grew shorter every time. Not even the herself of Rose Hill Close, who tended her garden and ran her reading group and called her sister every Sunday. Something older than both of those. The self that had existed before the roles settled onto her, before wife, before mother, before widow, before patient. The self that Eleanor had always called Maggie. The taxi stopped outside a stone cottage at the end of a narrow lane. Small garden, stone wall along the front, a rose bush on either side of the gate, bare in the autumn but clearly established, the canes thick and well-rooted. 30 years of growing. Margaret paid the driver and stood at the gate, with her boxes at her feet, and looked at what her sister had kept for her. Then she opened the gate, picked up the first box, and walked up the path to the front door. The key fit on the first try. The cottage smelled of Eleanor. Not perfume exactly. Eleanor had never been a perfume person, but the particular combination of things that had surrounded her for decades. Old books and wood smoke and the faint sweetness of the dried lavender she kept in small cloth bags in every room. Margaret stood in the narrow hallway with her box in her arms and breathed it in and felt the specific grief of a smell that belongs to someone who is gone. She set the box down. She did not rush. She moved through the cottage the way you move through a place that deserves to be understood rather than just seen. Slowly, paying attention, letting each room tell her what it had to say before she moved to the next. The sitting room was small and full, bookshelves along 2 walls filled with the accumulated reading of a woman who had lived alone with time and curiosity for 20 years. A wood-burning stove, cold now but well-maintained, a basket of logs beside it that Eleanor must have filled in the spring, knowing she would not be filling it again. 2 armchairs by the window, positioned to face the garden, worn to the shapes of someone who had spent years in one of them, and occasionally, when expecting company, remembered to plump the other. On the mantelpiece above the stove, photographs. Margaret moved toward them slowly. Eleanor and Gerald on their wedding day, 1974. Eleanor looking young and certain and slightly impatient the way she had always looked when someone was making her wait for something she wanted. The two of them, Margaret and Eleanor, outside their mother's house. A different photograph from the one in the box, later, both of them adults. Their mother visible at the edge of the frame, looking at something out of shot. Eleanor alone in the cottage garden, summer. Recent enough that Margaret could see the age in her face and the ease in her posture of someone entirely at home in the place she had chosen. And one more. Margaret picked it up. It was a photograph of Margaret that Margaret had never seen before. Taken through a window from outside, she was sitting at a kitchen table, reading, a cup of tea at her elbow, entirely unaware of the camera. The kitchen was her kitchen. Rose Hill Close. The year was impossible to determine exactly, but her hair was more gray than brown, which placed it somewhere in the last decade. Eleanor had been in her garden. She had looked through the window and seen her sister reading and taken a photograph. Margaret stood holding it for a long time. Then she put it back on the mantelpiece and went to the kitchen. The kitchen was small and practical and arranged with the same quiet logic that Eleanor had applied to everything. The dishes were on open shelves, sorted by size. The pans hung from a rack above the stove. On the windowsill, a row of small herbs in terracotta pots, most of them dry now, past saving, but still in their places as if waiting for someone to notice them. On the kitchen table was a notepad with Eleanor's handwriting on the top sheet. A list. Boiler service due in November. Plumber's number on the board by the back door. The garden wants cutting back before winter, the roses especially. The blue chair in the sitting room has a loose leg. Gerald kept meaning to fix it, and never did. I kept meaning to remind him in the same. Milk from the farm at the end of the lane. They do eggs also. The post office is Mrs. Harding. She knows everyone and everything and will be kind to you. Margaret read it twice, and then she tore the sheet carefully from the notepad, folded it, and put it in her pocket. A list of instructions for living in Eleanor's cottage, written by someone who knew she would not be there to give them in person. She stood in the kitchen for a moment. Then she found a mug, found the tea, found the kettle, and put it on. The desk was in the small room off the sitting room that Eleanor had used as a study. A proper writing desk, old, the leather surface worn smooth, a small lamp on one corner and a neat arrangement of stationery on the other. The folder was where Eleanor had said it would be. Margaret sat down at the desk and opened it. Inside were 37 pages. Eleanor had been methodical, dates down the left margin of each page, notes in her small, precise handwriting, newspaper cuttings in some places, printed emails in others. She had documented everything she had learned about what David and Susan were doing, not through confrontation or accusation, but through the quiet, persistent attention of someone who had decided that the truth needed a witness, even if that witness could do nothing immediately. The house being transferred to their names, documented. The estate agent being contacted before Margaret's discharge from hospital, documented. A conversation Susan had at a neighbor's party, reported to Eleanor secondhand by someone who had thought Susan's frankness about her mother's situation was in poor taste, documented. The storage unit cleared, the savings redirected, the decisions made and the language used to justify them, documented. In the careful handwriting of a woman who had understood that power operates most comfortably in the absence of records. Margaret read all 37 pages. It took her an hour and 20 minutes. When she finished, she closed the folder and sat at Eleanor's desk in Eleanor's study and looked at the lamp and thought about her sister spending the last years of her life doing this, quietly, persistently, from a stone cottage in the Lake District, building a case that she would never live to present. She thought about what that cost, the time, the energy, the particular exhaustion of paying that kind of attention to injustice when you are ill and alone and your own life is running out. She thought about the Sunday calls, all those conversations about the garden and the weather and the programs they had watched. Eleanor listening to the shape of what Margaret wasn't saying. She had been listening for years and doing something about it the entire time. Margaret put her hand flat on the closed folder. Then she got up, went to the kitchen, and made another cup of tea. The boiler was working fine. The kettle boiled quickly. Outside the study window, the garden was overgrown, but the roses along the front path were solid and deep-rooted and would come back beautifully in the spring. She could see that even now. She called Mr. Hartley the morning after she arrived. She told him about the folder. He was not surprised. He said Eleanor had mentioned it. He asked if Margaret wanted to discuss her options. Margaret said not yet. She wanted to settle in first. She would call him the following week. He said that was entirely sensible and that he was available whenever she was ready. She spent the first week learning the cottage. The loose leg on the blue chair, exactly as noted. The boiler that came on at 6:30 with a sound like someone clearing their throat. The particular creak of the third stair that she learned to avoid after the second night. The post office at the end of the village where Mrs. Harding was exactly as Eleanor had described. A small woman in her 70s with the comprehensive local knowledge of someone who had lived in the same place for 50 years and paid attention throughout. Mrs. Harding had known Eleanor. She said Eleanor had talked about Margaret often. Margaret asked what she had said. Mrs. Harding said Eleanor had said her sister was the most capable person she knew, and that it was a great shame the people around her hadn't understood that. Margaret thanked her and bought milk and eggs and walked back up the lane to the cottage and stood in the kitchen for a moment before putting the kettle on. Capable. Eleanor had always said that, even when they were children, even when Margaret had not felt it. She was going to try to deserve it. David and Susan arrived on a Saturday 3 weeks after Margaret had moved in. She had known they would come. She had not known exactly when, so she had simply continued living in the cottage as if they were not coming, and when their car appeared at the end of the lane on a gray October morning, she watched it from the sitting room window, with the blue armchair at her back, and the folder on the desk in the study, and her tea going cold in her hand. She let them knock. She let them knock twice before she went to the door. They came in and looked around the way people look around a place they are calculating the value of while pretending to be interested in it as a place. David commented on the view. Susan said it was smaller than she'd imagined. Neither of them said anything about Eleanor. Margaret offered tea. They said yes. She made it and brought it through, and they sat in the sitting room, David in the armchair by the bookshelf, Susan on the small sofa, Margaret in the blue chair by the window. And for a moment nobody said anything, and the cottage was quiet around them with the particular quality of a place that has absorbed a great deal of living and is not easily disturbed. David began. He said he understood this was what Eleanor had wanted, and he respected that. He said he had some concerns about the practicalities, Margaret's health, the remoteness, the winter coming. He said he wanted to make sure she had thought it through properly. Margaret said she had. Susan said they felt bad about how things had happened. With the house, with Pine View. Things had moved quickly after the stroke, and decisions had been made that perhaps weren't the right ones. She said this without quite looking at Margaret, her eyes moving between her tea and the window. Margaret said yes. They had been. A silence. David said they wanted to move forward, to find a way to make things right. Margaret looked at him. She had rehearsed this moment in the weeks since reading the folder. Not rehearsed what she would say exactly, but rehearsed the quality of it, the temperature of it, the pace. She did not want to be angry. Anger was a reasonable response, but it was also exhausting, and she had decided she was done being exhausted by these two people. She wanted to be clear. She went to the study and came back with the folder and set it on the coffee table between them. David looked at it. Margaret said Eleanor had kept records. She had documented the decisions they had made about the house, the timing of the estate agent, the storage unit, the conversations they had in other people's gardens about what to do with their mother. She said she had spoken to Mr. Hartley and that there were legal avenues available to her if she chose to pursue them, and that she had not yet decided whether she would. Susan had gone very still. David said he didn't know what was in that folder, but he was sure there was a reasonable explanation for. Margaret said she was not interested in reasonable explanations. Not because she was angry. She said this carefully so they would understand the difference. But because she had spent 2 years in a room with a window that faced a car park while her sister was dying and nobody told her, and her house was sold and her life was arranged around her like a problem being solved, and she was finished. Absolutely finished. With conversations in which the people who had done those things offered her reasonable explanations. She picked up her tea. She said she was willing to have a relationship with both of them, on certain conditions. The first was honesty, complete and permanent. The second was that decisions about her life would be made by her and nobody else, with whatever help she chose to ask for, and none that she didn't. The third was that they would not contact Mr. Hartley or make any inquiries about the cottage or Eleanor's estate. If those three conditions were met, she would consider the folder a private document. If they were not, she would make different decisions. David looked at the folder. Then he looked at his mother sitting in Eleanor's blue chair in Eleanor's cottage in the Lake District on a gray October morning, with her tea and her 37 pages of documentation and the particular calm of a woman who had already made up her mind about everything that mattered. He said he understood. Susan said they were sorry. Margaret looked at her. She said she believed her. Then she asked if they wanted more tea, and Susan said yes, and David said please. And Margaret went to the kitchen and put the kettle on and stood at the window looking out at the overgrown garden and the rose bushes that would need cutting back before winter. The cottage was quiet behind her. The kettle began to heat. Outside, a bird landed on the garden wall, looked at something, and flew away again. Ordinary morning. Her ordinary morning. Winter came early to the Lake District that year. By November, the hills were cold, and the lane outside the cottage was thick with fallen leaves, and the mornings required 2 layers and the blue armchair by the window and a cup of something hot before Margaret's body was ready to consider the day. She found she did not mind. She had always been a morning person, but the mornings at Pineview had been institutional things, alarms and schedules and the distant sounds of a building waking up around her. These mornings were hers. The stove lit at 7, the kettle on at past, the garden visible through the sitting room window doing whatever the season required of it while she sat with her tea and let the day arrive at its own pace. She called Mr. Hartley in November and told him she had decided not to pursue the legal options. Not because David and Susan deserved that generosity, but because she had decided her energy was more valuable spent elsewhere. He said he understood completely and that Eleanor would have approved. Margaret said she thought Eleanor would have pushed harder. Mr. Hartley laughed and said yes, probably, but Eleanor had also understood that some battles cost more than they return. David called every fortnight. The calls were different now, shorter in a way but fuller, less efficient, occasionally awkward in the way that honest things sometimes are when honesty is new. He had not yet found a register that was entirely natural, and Margaret did not expect him to find it quickly. Trust rebuilt slowly when it was rebuilt at all. She was patient. She had discovered she was good at patient. Susan came in December for 2 days. She slept in the small bedroom that had been Eleanor's guest room, and they ate meals together at the kitchen table and watched television in the evenings. And it was not comfortable exactly, but it was real in a way that the 4 times a year visits to Pineview had never been. On the second evening, Susan asked about Eleanor, about what she had been like in her last years, what the cottage said about the person who had lived in it. Margaret talked for an hour. Susan listened without waiting to speak. It was the longest real conversation they had ever had. Margaret cut the roses back in late November, the way Eleanor's note had instructed. She was not a gardener in the way Eleanor had been, but she had grown things for 40 years, and her hands knew what to do without needing to be told. She worked along the front path for 2 hours, her breath visible in the cold air, her hands in the thick gloves she had found hanging on the back of the cottage door. The roses were 30 years old and deeply established. Whatever happened to them in winter, they would come back in spring. She was certain of that. She found herself thinking about her mother, about the same roses growing in the same garden decades ago, and Eleanor taking cuttings the year before it was sold and carrying them north to the Lake District and growing them for 30 years so that they would be here, established and certain, when Margaret finally arrived. Planning for a future she would not be part of. Margaret stood in the cold garden with her secateurs and felt the full weight of that, the patience of it, the love of it, the particular kind of hope that plants a rose for someone who has not yet arrived. She stayed in the garden until the light began to go. Then she went inside and washed her hands and put the kettle on. There is a version of Margaret's story that ends in the care facility. That was the version David and Susan were writing, but Eleanor was writing a different version the whole time. Quietly, from a distance, in the last years of a life that was running out. She was building her sister a door out of the room with the car park window, building it carefully, legally, with 37 pages of documentation and a solicitor in Keswick and a music box and a key on a pale blue ribbon. And when Margaret finally walked through that door, she found not just a cottage or a garden or financial security. She found the evidence of a love that had been paying attention the entire time. That is what Eleanor left her. Not the cottage. The proof. If Margaret and Eleanor's story stayed with you today, leave one thing in the comments, not what made you sad. Tell us about someone in your life who showed you they cared in a way that only became clear later. Someone who was paying attention when you didn't know you needed anyone to be. Because that is what this story is really about. Not betrayal, not justice, not property or paperwork or legal folders. It is about the people who love us quietly and at a distance and without needing us to know, and who make sure, even when they are gone, that we eventually do. If you want more stories like this one, subscribe to this channel. We are here every week with a new story about someone who was written off too soon and found something extraordinary on the other side of it. We will see you in the next one.